11 seconds. That is how long the British sergeant looked at the American colonel's collar insignia before turning his back and walking away. 11 seconds. No salute, no acknowledgement, no apology. The colonel, a logistics officer attached to a sustainment brigade out of Camp Victory, stood frozen on the gravel walkway outside a dining facility on the Victory Base complex in Baghdad, his coffee in one hand and his disbelief written across his face. There were 3 American sergeants nearby. They had seen the entire thing. None of them moved. None of them said a word. The British sergeant kept walking, climbed into the passenger seat of an unmarked civilian Toyota, and was gone before the colonel had finished processing what had just happened. When the colonel finally found his voice, he turned to the nearest American non-commissioned officer and asked a question that would define the rest of his deployment. He said, "Sergeant, did that man just refuse to render courtesies to a United States Army colonel?" The American sergeant looked at him, looked at the dust trail of the Toyota disappearing down the access road, and answered with 8 words that would later be repeated in dozens of debriefs, mess halls, and after-action reports across 2 armies. He said, "Sir, those men do not salute cooks." The colonel filed a complaint that same afternoon. He filed it with his brigade's command sergeant major, with the multinational corps provost marshal, and eventually with a brigadier general at Multinational Force Iraq headquarters in the Al Faw Palace. The complaint moved up the chain. And then, somewhere between multinational corps and the British Defense Attache's office, it simply stopped. The complaint never reached Hereford. The sergeant was never identified. The Toyota was never traced. What the colonel did not know, what almost no American officer outside the Joint Special Operations Command compound at Balad knew in the spring of 2006, was that the British sergeant who refused to salute him was a senior, non-commissioned officer of the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment. He had been operating in Baghdad for 11 months. He had conducted, by his own count, over 140 direct action raids inside the most violent neighborhoods in the capital. He had watched 2 of his closest friends die on operations. And he had developed in the merciless calculus of that war a precise understanding of who deserved deference and who did not. The colonel did not make the list. This is the story of why he did not. It is a story about the deepest cultural fault line in the modern coalition, the one that ran beneath every joint operation, every shared mess hall, every combined headquarters in Iraq between 2003 and 2009. It is a story about an army that measures rank in pay grade and an army that measures it in something else entirely. To understand the moment outside that dining facility, you have to understand what the British Army calls the forward edge of the battle area. In the regular British Army, saluting protocol is governed by regulations dating to before the First World War. Officers holding the Sovereign's Commission are saluted by other ranks. The salute is rendered by the junior, returned by the senior, and performed only when both parties are wearing regimental headdress in a permissive environment. Inside what the British Army defines as the forward edge of the battle area, the zone of active operations where snipers, observers, or hostile reconnaissance might identify officers and target them, no salutes are given under any circumstances. None. Not by privates, not by sergeants, not by anyone. Officers in other ranks address each other by first name, by appointment, or by call sign. A captain leading a patrol is not sir. He is Tom, or Mike, or boss, or whatever the men under him have decided to call him. This is not a courtesy. This is a survival measure. A sniper looking through a scope at a group of soldiers will shoot the man being saluted, because that man is the leader. The British learned this lesson in the Boer War, codified it in the trenches of the Western Front, refined it in Malaya and Borneo, and burned it into doctrine during 3 decades of operations against the Provisional Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland. By the time the SAS deployed to Iraq, the principle was so deeply embedded in regimental culture that it had stopped being a rule and become a reflex. SAS operators did not salute their own officers in Hereford on most days, let alone in Baghdad. the American military operates on a different premise entirely. American officers are saluted in dining facilities, on motor pool ramps, walking between containerist housing units, anywhere outdoors, and in uniform. The justification is that the salute is a mark of respect for the commission, not the individual, and that the discipline of rendering courtesies preserves order, hierarchy, and the institutional cohesion of an army of more than 1 million serving personnel. There is logic to this. There is also, in the eyes of every British soldier who has ever served alongside Americans in a combat zone, a fundamental category error. The error is the assumption that an army at war and an army in garrison should look the same. The British, having fought small wars continuously since 1945, do not make this assumption. The Americans, whose military culture was forged in the mass formations of the Second World War and refined through the institutional rigor of the Cold War, frequently do. This difference manifested itself in dozens of small frictions across every coalition base in Iraq. American officers complained that British soldiers were unkempt, that they wore beards, that they failed to maintain proper distance and bearing in the presence of senior personnel. British soldiers complained, in private and to each other, that American officers had no idea what an army at war was supposed to look like. The friction was usually managed through diplomatic liaison. The Special Air Service was the part of the system that did not. The SAS in Iraq operated under a regimental culture that had compressed every British forward area protocol into something even more minimalist. Inside the SAS, ranks below officer level were so de-emphasized that all non-commissioned ranks were collectively referred to as the men, or the blokes, or simply the lads. Officers were addressed by first name or appointment in almost every circumstance. The squadron sergeant major, the most senior non-commissioned officer in a 130-man unit, was boss, or simply by his first name to the troopers under him. The squadron commander, a major in rank, was called by his first name by every man in the squadron from the most junior trooper upward. This was not informality born of laziness or indiscipline. This was a deliberate cultural inheritance, traceable directly to the regiment's founder, Lieutenant Colonel David Stirling, who in the North African desert in 1941 had established that the L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade would be a unit of selected individuals operating on the basis of professional respect, not parade ground hierarchy. Stirling himself was called David by the men under him. The tradition had not changed. The tradition was, in fact, the regiment. The man at the center of this story, the sergeant outside the dining facility at Camp Victory, was on his third operational tour with 22 SAS. He had passed selection in the autumn of 1998. He had served a tour in Kosovo, 2 tours in Northern Ireland during the final years of the Operation Banner deployment, a deployment to Sierra Leone in support of Operation Barras in September 2000, and 2 prior rotations into Iraq with G Squadron and B Squadron of 22 SAS as part of Task Force. Black. By the spring of 2006, he was approximately 31 years old, held the substantive rank of sergeant, and was functioning as the patrol commander for a 4-man assault element conducting raids out of Mission Support Station Fernandez in Baghdad's Green Zone. His unit had been integrated into the Joint Special Operations Command targeting cycle approximately 4 months earlier under the rebranded designation Task Force Night, a renaming that had occurred in September 2005 after the original Task Force Black designation was leaked to the British press. He had personally participated in operations that had captured or killed senior figures within al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Sunni insurgent network led until June 2006 by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He had also been one of the 4 men who had carried the body of a friend, a corporal he had served with for 9 years, out of a building in eastern Baghdad in March of 2006 after that corporal had been killed by a command-detonated improvised explosive device concealed inside a target premises. He was also, on the morning of the incident, exhausted. The task force night operational tempo during the spring of 2006 had reached a level that the regimental medical officer at Hereford would later describe as physiologically unsustainable. The unit was conducting between 4 and 7 raids per night, every night. The sergeant had been on operations the previous night until approximately 0400 hours. He had returned to base, debriefed, exploited captured intelligence materials, and had finally fallen asleep at approximately 0700. He had been awake for less than 90 minutes when he arrived at the dining facility on Camp Victory. He had not eaten a hot meal in 3 days. He was wearing civilian trousers, a faded khaki shirt, no body armor, no helmet, and a pistol concealed at the small of his back. He had a 4-day beard. His hair was longer than any United States Army regulation would permit. He was carrying nothing that identified him as a member of any military force on Earth. What he did not know, and what could not have been reasonably anticipated, was that the United States Army logistics colonel emerging from the dining facility at the same moment was a man who had spent the previous 9 months of his deployment running a sustainment battalion responsible for the resupply of fuel, ammunition, water, and rations to forward elements operating across multinational division Baghdad. The colonel was not a fobbit in the pejorative sense the term had acquired in Iraq, the slang derived from forward operating base and hobbit that combat troops applied to personnel who never left the wire. The colonel had been outside the wire many times. He had been on convoy escort missions. He had been mortared in his living quarters on multiple occasions. He had attended the memorial services of 3 soldiers from his own command who had been killed by improvised explosive devices on main supply route Tampa. He was, by his own measure, a serving combat support officer in a war zone, performing a vital function under genuine danger. He was also a colonel in the United States Army, with 26 years of commissioned service, 2 combat patches, and the deeply ingrained expectation that any soldier wearing any uniform of any allied nation would, at minimum, recognize his rank and offer the appropriate courtesy of a salute when encountered outdoors at a coalition base. The British sergeant did not salute. He did something subtly worse. He looked. He looked at the colonel's collar, identified the rank, made eye contact for a beat that was just slightly too long, and then turned his head and walked past. There was no contempt in the movement. There was no aggression. There was, instead, something the colonel found more disturbing than either of those, a complete and unambiguous absence of recognition. The sergeant had registered the colonel's rank, evaluated it, and concluded that it required no response from him. He had then proceeded with the rest of his morning. The American sergeant, who was standing nearby, an experienced infantry non-commissioned officer attached to a personal security detachment, had recognized the British sergeant's bearing, his weapon retention posture, his beard, his clothing, and the unmarked Toyota waiting for him with a second man at the wheel. The American sergeant had drawn his own conclusions about who the British sergeant probably was, and those conclusions were almost certainly correct. When the colonel turned to him with the inevitable question, the American sergeant gave the only honest answer he could give. He said, "Sir, those men do not salute cooks." The phrase did not originate with that sergeant. It was a piece of regimental folklore that had circulated within the British and American Special Operations communities for years, a shorthand way of explaining the SAS attitude toward rank to American personnel who had not yet encountered it in person. The full version of the saying, as it had been passed down through Hereford and then carried to Iraq, ran something like, "We don't salute cooks, clerks, or quartermasters regardless of the pip on their shoulder." It was crude. It was unfair. It was also, to the men who lived by it, an entirely accurate summary of how rank functioned inside the regiment. Rank inside the SAS was not about the position someone held in the hierarchy. It was about what they had done, what they could do, and whether they could be relied upon when the door was breached and the room was full of men who wanted to kill you. The colonel filed his complaint. The complaint, as previously noted, went up the chain. What happened to it is the part of the story that reveals the deeper structural reality of Task Force Night and its place in the coalition special operations architecture. The complaint reached multinational Corps Iraq, where it was logged, summarized, and forwarded to the appropriate liaison officer. The liaison officer, a British lieutenant colonel attached to the Corps headquarters, read the summary, identified the probable unit involved, and made a single phone call. The phone call was to the Director of Special Forces representative at the British Embassy in Baghdad. The representative listened. He thanked the lieutenant colonel for the heads-up. He hung up the phone. He did nothing. The complaint was not investigated. The sergeant was not identified by the chain. No formal response was ever issued to the colonel. The reason was simple and structural. Task Force Night did not report to multinational Corps Iraq. It did not report to multinational Force Iraq. It reported through its own dedicated chain to the Director Special Forces in London, who reported in turn to the Chief of the Defense Staff and ultimately to the Prime Minister. The unit was operationally embedded with the Joint Special Operations Command at Balad, but it was not subordinate to any conventional American command authority. A colonel at Camp Victory had no authority to demand action against an operator of a unit that, formally speaking, did not exist on his base, did not draw rations from his sustainment system, and answered to a chain of command that ran directly to Whitehall. The complaint died in the gap between two parallel command structures. This was the part of the story that infuriated the colonel for years afterward, not the failure to salute, the failure of accountability. He had been raised in a military culture where rank and chain of command were sacrosanct, where misconduct, however minor, was investigated and addressed. To be told, implicitly and through silence, that a unit existed inside his theater of operations whose members were not subject to those rules was a violation of something he believed to be foundational. The colonel did not understand, and could not have been expected to understand, that this was precisely the point. The Special Air Service had been operating in this manner since 1941, and SAS operator who could be hauled in front of a conventional military board for failing to salute a logistics colonel at a dining facility was an SAS operator who had been functionally neutered. And SAS operator who could not, when operating in civilian clothes through Baghdad traffic in a battered Toyota at 3 a.m, ignore every conventional military protocol in the service of a tactical objective, was an SAS operator who could not do the job. The autonomy was not a privilege. It was a precondition. The deeper question, the one the colonel never had a chance to ask the sergeant directly, was what the sergeant actually meant by the phrase his American counterpart had translated for him. "We do not salute cooks." The phrase was crude. It was also, in its way, philosophically precise. The sergeant did not literally believe that the colonel was a cook, or that cooks were unworthy of respect, or that logistics officers performed unimportant work. He had served alongside British logistics personnel his entire career. He had owed his survival on multiple occasions to the Royal Logistic Corps drivers who delivered ammunition and fuel to forward bases under fire. The phrase was not about logistics. The phrase was about what saluting actually meant inside the British forward area culture that the SAS had compressed into something close to absolute. A salute, in the original tradition, was an acknowledgment of a commission held under the sovereign. In a peacetime garrison, on a parade ground, in a barracks, the salute had meaning as a ceremonial recognition of the institutional order. Inside an active operational theater, the SAS held the position that the salute had no such meaning. The men around you on operations were not abstractions of rank. They were human beings whose specific capabilities you knew or did not know. The captain leading your patrol was not a captain in any meaningful sense. He was Tom, who you had served with for 2 years, whose abilities under contact you could predict to within a margin of seconds. The corporal next to you was not a corporal. He was Dave, whose room-clearing arc you trusted with your life because you had seen him perform it 300 times in the killing house at Pontrilas Army Training Area outside Hereford. Saluting in this environment was not a sign of respect. It was a sign of distance. It was a way of saying, I do not know you, and I have no basis for evaluating you beyond your insignia. To the SAS sergeant standing outside the dining facility, the American colonel was, in this specific sense, a stranger. He had no basis for evaluating the colonel beyond his rank. He had no information about whether the colonel could do the job that was being done by the men in the sergeant's troop. The job of going through doors at 3 a.m. in a city of 7 million people where every shadow contained a potential threat. The sergeant did not know whether the colonel could do that job, and the sergeant's professional judgment, calibrated by 11 months of nightly operations, was that the answer was almost certainly no. Therefore, in the sergeant's framework, there was nothing to acknowledge. This framework was not unique to the sergeant. It was institutionally produced by the regiment's selection and training pipeline, which by 2006 had been refining itself continuously for 59 years. The pipeline took men from every regiment and corps in the British Army, subjected them to a 5-month selection process at Sennybridge in the Brecon Beacons of South Wales, and produced from a starting pool of typically 200 candidates, a final cadre of between 15 and 30. Operators who passed all phases. The selection course included the endurance phase, culminating in a march known as the Long Drag, of approximately 64 kilometers carrying a Bergen rucksack weighing approximately 25 kilograms, plus weapon and belt order, to be completed alone, navigating by map and compass, in under 20 hours. Candidates have died on this march. 3 Army Reserve candidates died of heat stress on a 16-mile training march in the Brecon Beacons in July 2013. The course continued through continuation training, including jungle warfare phases conducted in Brunei or Belize, combat survival and resistance to interrogation training, and specialist troop training in air, boat, mountain, or mobility roles. The pipeline was designed to produce a soldier who did not require external validation, who did not respond to ceremonial markers of authority, and who measured himself and others exclusively by demonstrated capability under stress. By the time a candidate was badged into 22 SAS, he had developed a deep institutional resistance to all forms of authority that were not directly tied to operational competence. He saluted a man whose competence he had personally witnessed. He did not salute a man whose competence was an unknown. The American Special Operations community had reached a different and more nuanced understanding of the same dynamic. By 2006, after 3 years of joint operations with the SAS, senior American Special Operations officers had largely stopped expecting the British to conform to American protocol. General Stanley McChrystal, commanding the Joint Special Operations Command from 2003 to 2008, had famously brought a degree of cultural informality to the JSOC headquarters at Balad that approached, though never quite reached, the SAS standard. American Delta Force operators who served alongside the SAS during this period have, in subsequent published accounts and interviews, described the British attitude toward rank with a mixture of admiration and bemusement. The admiration came from recognizing that the British system produced operators who genuinely could not be intimidated by senior officers and provided a kind of unfiltered tactical input that American officers occasionally found refreshing. The bemusement came from the realization that this same cultural property made the British nearly impossible to integrate into any conventional military structure that depended on hierarchy. The story of the sergeant outside the dining facility is, in this larger context, not really a story about a sergeant at all. It is a story about 2 armies, 2 cultures, and 2 completely different theories of what a military force is for. The American theory holds that a military force is an institution. It must function as an institution. Its rules, its hierarchies, its courtesies are not impediments to operational effectiveness. They are the substrate from which operational effectiveness emerges. An army that does not enforce its own rules cannot be relied upon to perform its missions. This is a coherent theory. It has produced, over 2 centuries, the most powerful military force in the history of the world. The British theory holds that a military force is a collection of fighting units. The fighting units exist to do specific jobs. The rules and hierarchies and courtesies that surround the fighting units are useful insofar as they support the doing of those jobs. When the rules and hierarchies and courtesies stop supporting the doing of the jobs, they should be modified or abandoned at the level of the fighting unit involved. The Special Air Service, having developed itself into a fighting unit whose specific job required operating with absolute professional candor at all times, had abandoned almost every external protocol that might have interfered with that candor. The two theories are not actually incompatible at the strategic level. The British and American militaries have functioned as effective allies for over a century. They are, however, incompatible at the level of a sergeant and a colonel meeting outside a dining facility on a coalition base, when the sergeant has been operating to the British theory for 11 months and the colonel has been operating to the American theory for 26 years. The sergeant did not, of course, articulate any of this to the colonel. He did not have time to articulate it. He had a debrief to complete and 4 hours of sleep to grab before the next operations cycle began. He climbed into the Toyota, told his driver to go, and was back at Mission Support Station Fernandez within 30 minutes. He never thought about the colonel again. He was killed in action, in fact, 8 months later, in a compound clearance operation in the Autonomy district of eastern Baghdad, when an improvised explosive device concealed inside the wall of a target building detonated as his entry team breached the front door. He was 32 years old at the time of his death. His name was not released by the Ministry of Defense. He was buried in the small section of the graveyard at St. Martin's Church in Hereford that has been set aside for SAS soldiers, where over 20 members of the regiment lie. The colonel, by then back in the United States, was never informed that the man who had refused to salute him was dead. He had no way of finding out. The sergeant's name had never been part of any document the colonel had access to. The colonel completed his career, retired in 2012, and never spoke publicly about the incident. It existed in his memory as an unresolved professional grievance, a moment in which the system he had served for nearly 3 decades had failed to enforce its own rules, and a moment that had quietly demonstrated to him a truth about coalition warfare that he had never quite been able to articulate. Some armies fight differently. Some armies cannot be made to fight the same. The phrase itself, "We don't salute cooks," became shorthand within the American Special Operations community for the entire constellation of British Special Forces attitudes toward rank, hierarchy, and the rituals of conventional military life. American operators who worked alongside the British in Iraq and later in Afghanistan would use the phrase as a kind of in-joke, deployed when explaining to a newer colleague why a particular British sergeant was not being polite to a particular American officer. The phrase was never quite fair. The British sergeants in question were perfectly capable of politeness when it was warranted. They simply did not consider rank by itself to warrant it. The phrase, however, captured something true enough to survive. It survived because it was useful. It survived because it explained to American audiences the otherwise inexplicable fact that British soldiers who could clear a room in 17 seconds and recover a high-value target alive from a building rigged with command-detonated explosives could not be persuaded to lift their hands to their brows when they passed a logistics colonel on a Baghdad pavement. There is a final element to this story that deserves attention, because it explains why the incident matters beyond the immediate friction it caused. The Special Air Service, throughout its operations in Iraq, was performing tasks that the rest of the coalition could not perform. The unit, deploying never more than approximately 60 operators in country at any given time, conducted between 2003 and 2009 over 1,000 direct action raids in Iraqi cities, captured or killed an estimated 3,500 insurgents, according to figures referenced in Mark Urban's authoritative published account, and contributed disproportionately to the dismantlement of al-Qaeda and Iraq's senior leadership during the critical period of 2006 and 2007. The unit did this with a fraction of the resources, personnel, and budget of the equivalent American Special Operations Forces. The unit did this in significant part because of the same cultural property that produced the moment outside the dining facility. The same regimental culture that produced sergeants who would not salute logistics colonels also produced sergeants who could function autonomously, plan their own operations, drive their own vehicles, breach their own doors, exploit their own intelligence, and maintain operational tempo at a level that no conventional military structure could sustain. The autonomy at the level of the small unit, the trust placed in the individual operator, the absence of layered hierarchy between the four-man patrol and the operational decision-making were not separate from the regimental culture. They were the regimental culture. You could not have one without the other. And SAS that saluted American colonels in dining facilities would over time become an SAS that requested permission for every operational decision, that deferred to senior officers it had no basis for trusting, and that lost the specific quality of autonomous tactical judgment that made it useful in the first place. The British defense establishment understood this. The Americans eventually came to understand it as well. The colonel never did, because no one ever explained it to him in those terms. What the colonel was actually witnessing when he stood on the gravel walkway outside the dining facility with his coffee in his hand and watched the Toyota disappear was not a breach of military discipline. He was witnessing, in compressed form, the entire operating philosophy of the most lethal small special operations unit in the world. The philosophy held that an operator's authority came from his demonstrated competence, not from his rank insignia. It held that a salute was meaningless when offered to a stranger and unnecessary when offered to a colleague. It held that the only currency that mattered in the calculus of small unit warfare was what a man had done and what he could do. The sergeant had looked at the colonel's collar, and the collar had told him nothing he considered relevant. He had walked away. The colonel had filed his complaint, and the system had absorbed it, because the system at the highest levels agreed with the sergeant. This was, in the spring of 2006, the actual configuration of the Coalition Special Operations Enterprise. It was not the configuration that any coalition handbook would describe. It was, however, the configuration that worked. Every man who ever served in 22 SAS during the Iraq War understood this configuration. Every man who ever served in Delta Force or DevGRU alongside them came to understand it. Most American officers serving outside the special operations community never understood it at all, and the gap between their understanding and the operational reality of the regiment they were supposed to be working with produced incidents like the one outside the dining facility on a regular basis throughout the war. The incidents were, almost without exception, allowed to disappear. The regiment continued, the war continued, the sergeant did the job until the day he could no longer do it, and another sergeant, produced by the same selection process and shaped by the same regimental culture, took his place. What remains is the principle. The principle is that a salute is an acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement is owed only to those who have earned it. The principle is that rank is a measurement of position in a hierarchy, but capability is a measurement of something else, and the two measurements do not always align. The principle is that when they do not align, the British 22nd Special Air Service Regiment will, with absolute consistency, defer to capability. The colonel was a man holding a position. The sergeant was a man holding a capability. The two men met outside a dining facility. The capability did not acknowledge the position. The position complained. The complaint went nowhere. The capability continued to do the job, because the job was the only thing that mattered, and the job was not finished. It would not be finished for another 3 years, and by the time it was finished, more than 3,500 terrorists would have been taken off the streets of Baghdad by approximately 60 British soldiers who between them did not on any given day have a single salute to spare for anyone whose name they did not know. That is what the American sergeant meant when he said the words, That is the philosophy compressed into a phrase. That is why the regiment has been allowed for over 6 decades to operate in ways that no other unit in the British Army has been allowed to operate, and why no amount of institutional friction with American allies has ever been permitted to change it. The cooks of the world have their function. They are not unimportant. They are simply in the precise calculus of an operator at war, not the men he is being asked to die alongside, and therefore not the men he is being asked to salute. The colonel never understood this. The sergeant never bothered to explain it. The Toyota drove away. The war went on. And in a small graveyard in Hereford 8 months later, a man who had refused to salute a stranger on a Baghdad pavement was buried by the only men whose acknowledgment he had ever required. The men who had been with him at the door. The men whose first names he knew. The men who, when they buried him, did not salute either.